this is our way of paying homage to the languages of New York and paying homage to Catalonia. And because the West Village Business Improvement District is our host this year and have taken a chance on shutting down Christopher Street and putting up a stage and all of that, we wanted to make the connection with the West Village. Of course, the West Village is the cradle of American literature. Everybody has lived here. And so many everybody that I'm not going to remember: James Baldwin, Patricia Highsmith, Juna Barnes, Anais Nin, etc., etc. And but we wanted to concentrate on the hidden figures, the ones that didn't write in English. And the best way to do that was to concentrate on Latin American literature. Esther is the translator of José Martí, of the complete essays of José Martí, and also the biography of José Martí. And she's going to tell us about Martí in New York, and with a little bit of the detour into the West Village, right? And his
special emphasis on the West Village.
Special emphasis. As requested. That has grown. Yes. And I'd like to introduce Marguerite Feitlowitz, who was a professor at Bennington. She was my roommate 30 years ago. Yeah. Isn't that wild? And she has translated. And tell me, remind me the names of the poet that you read in last year's.
Oh, okay. So yes, in Sant Jordi's Past, I've read from my translations of Chilean poet Ennio Moltero. I've also read Liliana Tlan and Griselda Yambaro.
Yes. And you can find all of that on the website of Sant Jordi NYC. Everything is archived there. And Marguerite has organized this whole event. There is well, I'll let you talk about the video that's in the online program and how we're going to make reference to it in the course of this talk. But Suzanne Jill Levine, who's the translator of Manuel Puig, which is the connection with Jaime Manrique, and the biographer of Manuel Puig, is coming to New York in a month, so she couldn't be with us today. But she and Luisa Valenzuela taped a conversation with Marguerite, which again you can see on the web, and we'll be making reference to it copiously, I think. And thank you all for being here.
Some of us are here, and some of us are not here, as you've probably noticed. Those who are not here are Jaime Manrique, who is a wonderful writer born in Cuba, has lived in the West Village for a very long time. He wrote a fabulous book called Eminent Maricones,
which we should stump to get reissued.
It's really a landmark volume. And he also was very close to Puig, and he will tell us a lot about that. Jaime also is a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer
and a poet
and a poet and just an all-around person of letters, and you'll discover that for yourselves in a little while. Interestingly enough, the relationships among Puig and Luisa Valenzuela, whose work I also translate, are also very direct. Puig was well, you'll hear all about it, but there are lines from Puig to Jill to Luisa that all kind of intertwine. Puig brought Luisa to Colombia, and he also nominated her to be in the University of Iowa International Writers Program, where, as she's told me, that was where she first discovered she was a Latin American writer, because she had met other Latin American writers. So Luisa Valenzuela, as we speak, and that's no exaggeration, is at the Buenos Aires Book Fair. And there's a big part of the book fair that is actually devoted to her and her work. And so everybody's getting Luisa Valenzuela bookmarks and things like that. She has a large body of work. She's sort of on the cusp of the boom generation and the post-boom generation. And she is a supremely cosmopolitan writer. And we'll talk more about that, because I think she plugs into the very cosmopolitan nature of the West Village.
Why? How did you? Go ahead.
This is just an outline.
Yes.
And what was I about to say about
Cosmopolitan nature.
cosmopolitan nature of the West Village? Thank you. And so Jill Levine, who, as Marianne was saying, is a translator, biographer, and memoirist now. And Luisa and I recorded a talk that went on for so long and was so amusing that we couldn't figure out how to cut it and present it in a way that would be palatable in a live format. So it is available to you online. And also, Jill does a reading from her biography of Puig online. And then Luisa and I recorded a very short reading from a novel she wrote that takes place in New York, but she wrote when she returned to Buenos Aires. She reads a couple of pages in Spanish, and I read the translation, and that's online too. But more of that later, because we're going to hear now from Esther Allen.
Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you, Marianne, for organizing this, and thank you everybody for coming on this glorious evening. I feel sorry for you that you have to look at me and I'm looking at Little Island. So I'll be quick because we want to get to the delirious intrigue of 20th century Southern Cone, Greenwich Village. So we're going to start with 19th century Caribbean Greenwich Village. New York is obviously a Caribbean city. We have a neighborhood called Jamaica. We have the West Indies Day Parade. We are a very Caribbean city. And I'd say most present-day New Yorkers know that, but what they might not know is that we've been a very Caribbean city for a very long time, going way back into the 19th century. And one of the outstanding figures of Caribbean history and of the history of the Americas is José Martí. He was born in 1853 in Cuba. He lived most of his life in exile, most of his adult life in New York City. He came here in 1880. He moved here, so he was based in New York for 15 years. He wrote enormously and extensively about New York and the United States as a foreign correspondent for newspapers across Latin America. And what you said about Luisa Valenzuela discovering in Iowa that she was Latin American, Martí is one of the figures who really defines Latin America. He's not just definitive for Cuba, he becomes a definitive thinker of what is Latin America. And that happens in New York because he's the consul for Uruguay, he's the consul for Argentina, he's meeting people from all over the Caribbean and all over Latin America. He has this little dictionary where he's jotting down words that mean different things in different Latin American languages, different Latin American Spanishes. So he really discovers the entirety of Latin America in New York City in this microcosm and starts thinking hemispherically in New York City. So it's really defining for him. And at the same time, he's plotting the revolution that will free Cuba from Spanish rule because Cuba was still a Spanish colony, as almost all of you know. This is José Martí's son, José Francisco Martí Zayas Bazán, who was a general in the Republic of Cuba and who visited Washington, D.C. in 1917, many decades after his father's death, when this photo was taken. Interestingly enough, in 2021, someone paid to have a census done of all the public monuments in the United States of America. This is in light of Marianne very naturally said we're talking about hidden figures tonight, right? And I guess for many people in the United States, Martí is a hidden figure. However, the Monuments Lab in Philadelphia did a census of all public monuments in the United States in 2021, and they discovered that, of course, the most monumentalized figure, obviously these are public monuments, not church monuments. The most monumentalized figure is Abraham Lincoln. The 20th most monumentalized figure is William Shakespeare. And the 21st most monumentalized figure in the United States of America is José Martí. However, the people who put together the Monuments Project and the document that accompanied it had no idea who José Martí was. So despite being the 21st most monumentalized figure in the United States of America, they knew so little about him that they had included a photo of his son taken in 1917 in military uniform, which for anyone who knows anything about Martí, the fact that he he was a journalist, that he was a civilian, that it wasn't until the very end of his life that he assumed the title of general when he went back to Cuba to fight. He was killed almost immediately. There are no photos of him in military uniform. He is not a military figure. He is not a religious figure. He is a secular figure, a figure of civil society. So the idea of putting him there in military uniform is just like, if you're a Cuban, it's, yeah, it's just, So it's so all of this is a lesson in how hard it is. You have a Cuban community in the United States that works so hard to foreground this figure who they know to be part of the history of the United States. He becomes the 21st most monumentalized figure in the country. There's a monument to him on 59th Street, at Central Park South, and nobody knows who he is still. I once was standing next to that monument, and a cab driver, or one of those horse and carriage drivers, came by and said to his passengers, "That's the guy that wrote the lyrics to Guantanamera." As if he were primarily known as a songwriter, right? Like, what are you going to do?
At least you know that, though.
Yeah, at least they knew that.
It's more than these guys.
In 2017, I saw this kind of forlornly plastered to a pillar on West 27th Street. And I thought, more than any monument, more than anything else I've ever seen, that says what José Martí is to New York City. Like some kind of vague shadow. You can vaguely read the word revolution, kind of all twisted around, a vague.
That's beautiful.
That's
amazing.
I found it very, very poignant. And it was like, if you recognize, you recognize, and if you don't, you don't, right? Just to give some idea, because Pope Francis is in the news, and I thought, I bet Martí was an important figure to Pope Francis, to give an idea of how important he is to people. And yes, indeed, there's a conference convened in Havana every year for the past 6 years, which is titled Por el equilibrio del mundo, which is a phrase from Martí for the equilibrium of the world. And it meets around the time of Martí's birthday in January. And Pope Francis very regularly sends did until his recent passing, sent a message to that Congress every year, official Vatican message from the Pope, generally reflecting on the importance of Martí. In one of the messages, he described Martí as an hombre de luz, a man of light. And he was citing the phrase that Pope John Paul used about Martí when Pope John Paul visited Cuba in 1998. And in 2024, I was particularly interested to see that in this official papal missive, Francis cited an article published in Patria, which was a newspaper Martí published right here in New York City, and which was about Father Felix Varela, a Cuban priest who lived in New York in the early 19th century, and who was a huge influence on Martí, a huge figure, a figure also of liberation, a figure of exile from the island, protest. And there's a statue to Felix Varela at his church, which is now part of Chinatown. So overlays of New York City history, right? If you want to see the Cuban priest, you go to Chinatown, to the church that's now all Chinese. So nevertheless, there have been a number. I can't talk about this without telling you about all these fantastic recent work that's been done. Lisandro Perez's Sugar, Cigars, and Revolution, and specifically Jesse Hoffman-Garskoff, who's now at Harvard, did a book called Racial Migrations, which is specifically about the school I want to tell you about tonight, La Liga, which was on West 3rd Street and Bleecker Street in the heart of the West Village, not far from Washington Square, and where José Martí taught. Another professor at Pace University has recently done this incredible interactive website recovering New York City's 19th century Spanish language press, because New York was very actively publishing in Spanish, many newspapers, many publishing houses, bookstores, and you can actually find maps and charts of where all these places were in this really interesting project done a couple of years ago out of Pace University. So I'm just going to give you a tiny glimpse today. By 1889, Martí had been living in New York for 9 years. He had a significant. He came. Because New York was where all the wealthy Cubans had retreated from the horrors of the Independence War. It was the center of the independence movement off the island, and Martí needed to be here. He was somewhat reluctant to be here, but this was clearly where he needed to be to pursue the great cause of his life, which was the independence of Cuba from Spain. So he'd been living here for 9 years. In the middle of that period, Martí has a huge fight with the two generals who are leading the revolution, Máximo Gómez and Maceo. At a hotel on 9th Street in the West Village, called the Hotel Griffou, which was run by a Haitian woman who had also passed through Cuba. And a few years ago, to give you an idea of just how you can't get this figure through, somebody reopened on the same spot as the Hotel Griffou a bar and restaurant called the Hotel Griffou. And they said this was this historic village spot where all of these people, my candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night. What's that poet? Edna St. Vincent Millay, thank you very much. All of these figures had passed through this bar. And I said, well, actually, this is the scene. The Hotel Griffou was the scene of one of the most famous disputes in Cuban history, where the generals start treating Martí like he's an underling, like he's someone for them to order around, and he starts getting worried that what's going to happen in Cuba will be what has happened so often in Latin America before, which is that liberation will be won only to turn into a military dictatorship. And so he turns on his heel and he says, a country is not governed, general, the way a military camp is commanded, words which seem to be quite relevant today in many different places. And he leaves and says, that's it. I'm not devoting any more of my energy to their cause because I'm very afraid of what's going to happen. But by 1889, there's been a rapprochement. The generals are willing to concede that they need the civilian leadership and the funding that Martí can help channel to them. And they need this epic moral figure that Martí represents to the Cuban community in order to really get the movement off the ground. Because on their own, they have fizzled, they have failed, nothing has happened. And they realize they need Martí, and they've come to Martí. But at that point, he's working very hard. He's writing articles for newspapers across Latin America. And that particular year, 1989, he's working with two very close friends of his, Juan Bonilla, born in Key West, to the Cuban family in Key West, thus in the United States, and Rafael Serra, who was born to a free family, a very poor free family in Havana, and very much like Martí, who was also born to a free family, although a very poor family. He immediately distinguishes himself with his pursuit of education. When he's only 21 years old, he founds a free school for both boys and girls and for all races in Matanzas. And he gets involved in Cuban independence movement as well, has to leave the island for that reason, comes to New York in 1880. And in 1889, with Martí, they decide to found a free school on 3rd Street in the village for working people of color from the Caribbean, men and women. And Bonilla and Serra are writers, they're journalists. Serra founds many, many newspapers over the course of his lifetime. He will go on to become a congressman during the Republic of Cuba. Saying that Cuba gained its independence is a little problematic, but something like that. Juan Bonilla, both of them will contribute to Martí's newspaper. He works with them very, very closely. He treats them as colleagues. And to give you an idea of the level of commitment that he has to this school, he is running into financial difficulties in 1990, around this period, because he's had to resign as consulate of Uruguay, which was part of his income stream, and he's pulling back from publishing his crónicas all over Latin America because he's devoting himself wholly to the Cuban Revolution, which doesn't pay. So he needs a paying job. So a friend of his who's a professor at City University of New York, like me, gets him a job teaching Spanish at the Central Evening High School on East 63rd Street in New York. And this is a very onerous job, as he describes in this letter to Rafael Serra from 1890, because he teaches 5 nights a week from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. On East 63rd Street. And then he's going to teach, because these are working people. They can't go to school during the day, so they have to devote their evenings to classes. So then he promises Rafael Serra in this letter, he says, porque doy clase de español de 7 a 9, de la noche en una de las escuelas nocturnas de la calle 63 al este, no quiere decir que ha de querer decir que no me quede corazón y voz para empezar a las 9:20 o cosa así nuestra charla de los jueves. So he's promising that he will, 20 minutes later, 20 minutes after leaving his classroom on East 63rd Street, he will be at the school on Bleecker Street. Which is a little bit of a, he's like, maybe not expect. But I actually, with the B train today, you could technically make that like in 21 minutes. I don't know if the elevated train of that period, I'm always like, really? Was he one of these Cubans who just like exaggerates how quickly he can do something and always shows up late? I don't know. Or people like me who do the same thing. So anyway, this is one of the letters to Sierra. You can see the incredible warmth and bond of friendship and the sense of mission. En mis amigos de la Liga tengo orgullo y fe. Hombres estamos creando y lo somos. In my friends at La Liga, I have pride and faith. We are creating men and we are men. And he meant hombres in the sense of mankind because the classes included women. Which his classes at the Central Evening High School did not include. So I'm thinking about the view of New York and what he must have experienced about New York in this period, because for 2 hours from 7 to 9 p.m., he's teaching at an all-male high school, all-white high school, but they are immigrant students. You can tell from the names of these two students who are protesting a year later after Martí left for school to start at 7:30 p.m. instead of 7 so they can have dinner before they go to class, because at the moment they don't even have time to have dinner. And they're going to class 5 nights a week. And so you can see that these are Irish students, Jewish students, Italian students, people, white immigrants to New York City. And he's working with them for 2 hours for pay. He is getting paid by the Board of Ed to do this. And then he rushes downtown to work with the students at La Liga for free for the rest of the evening. And he becomes, it's almost like a family thing. On Monday nights at La Liga, everybody brings their children. I think somebody should make a film about this. Imagine this group. And it's people from across the Caribbean. At some point, he can't teach anymore because he's too committed to the revolution, and he's traveling all the time, nonstop, to Tampa, to Key West, to Cuban communities across the country where tobacco workers are giving him a part of their weekly salary every week to contribute to the revolution, so that there will be money for the revolution. But in 1893, there's an article in Patria about how he has come back and he's returned to La Liga for a visit. Oh, actually, this is 1892. Sorry, I got the year wrong. And everyone is thrilled to have him there, and he gives an account to the people because La Liga was not just for Cubans, it was pan-Caribbean. And so he gives an account of his recent visits to Jamaica, Haiti, and Santo Domingo, to the New Yorkers from those places who are gathered in the school. And because he was traveling not just within the United States, but all across the Caribbean and even as far as Costa Rica, to generate support from the Cuban community in this tremendous effort that he makes for the last couple of years of his life before he returns to Cuba and dies. I just want to tell you a little bit more about these two. Serra, they both worked in cigar factories, which is very important because cigar workers could become educated, because as they rolled the leaves, the lector would read and they would learn. And they both became very educated as a result of that. They both wrote for Patria, and they both played significant roles in the burgeoning Cuban Republic in the early 20th century. And finally, I just want to end with this. The United States' lack of reception, I think we can understand the lack of reception of José Martí that I discussed initially with this. He's the 21st most monumentalized person, but no one knows who he is. Because his very existence counteracts the entire premise that underlay the Spanish-American War. And if you go to Central Park South, there's the statue of Martí at the moment of his death, which is a very weird thing. Why do you portray a person at the moment of their death? Very strange. And then not far from it, you have the monument to the Maine with this giant, hugely expensive to the soldiers. And even here you can see there's a calendar behind that says, remember the Maine. And the pretext of this imperial adventure that was the Spanish-American War was that the United States was bringing democracy to these hopelessly untutored, almost savage children in the Caribbean who knew nothing, who understood nothing, who were just babies being dandled on. There's obviously an enormous amount of contempt in this cartoon, which is one of many, many, many cartoons. And so if you actually know that there was this extraordinary figure who was a diplomat and a leader and a journalist and renowned worldwide, and who was teaching with other people who were also journalists, and right here in New York City, this propaganda will falter and fail. And somehow it still hasn't faltered and it still hasn't failed. And we're still resisting the idea of Martí. But, we keep trying. So thank you for coming tonight.
Yes. I'm sorry. We have to call Jaime up. Esther, yes. While we get Jaime on, does anybody want to ask anything? I'm always astonished at how, we say Martí traveled from Jamaica to, as if this were something,
As if you're hopping a flight.
Yeah. But it's just, I don't know. I'm.
Jess?
I have a question. For those whose Spanish is shaky, where would one start reading with Martí? What is the game?
Esther just happens to.
Well, I did the Penguin Classics translation of José Martí, so which it's like a selected writings of José Martí, in the Penguin Classics. And one of the things that Martí's complete works in one edition are 29 volumes, but the critical authoritative edition, which friends of mine are working on in Havana, is already at 33 volumes, and they think it's going to be like 4. He was one of these people who just wrote torrentially all the time, and he dies at 43. So and there are what's really fascinating is with digital humanities, it's actually a great digital humanities story because they're constantly finding new articles, because newspaper writing in the 19th century was generally anonymous. Very rarely did someone have their name. And so Martí wrote a lot in Mexico. He lived there for several years. He wrote a lot kind of more or less anonymously in other papers that he edited or that he worked with. And now that a lot of old things are being digitized and going online, and you can actually find, and the people at the Centro de Estudios Martianos are finding all the time new pieces that are clearly by Martí, because he has this very distinctive style and this very distinctive set of concerns, and adding them to the complete. So he's been dead since 1895, and his complete works, which is already vast, keeps growing. So he's a pretty amazing figure that way.
Since he wrote in different genres, what were the selection criteria for this?
Well, he mostly wrote journalism. And he wrote something called a crónica, which is a kind of, it's almost like you could almost consider it like a blog. Like it takes all the news stories of the day and sort of, people are becoming much more accustomed to it now. Like somebody just published a collection of Clarice Lispector's crónicas. You might think of the new journalism of the 70s, like it's a little bit more personal. It's a little bit more like you have the individual perspective weaving through all the news stories of the day and kind of piecing them together. And he wrote like about the memorial meeting to Karl Marx at Cooper Union, and he wrote about the inauguration of Benjamin Harrison, and anything you want to mention. He has some the Haymarket riots. All of this is there in Martí, and so much more.
There was a number there, and I said, when he answered, I just couldn't believe it, and I said, I'm so interested in your class. And he said, sure, well, bring me your, whatever you've written. And he gave me the address at Bedford Street. And so I went there with, I had written a short novella when I was living in Madrid. and he opened the door a crack. He said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Cartagena." I said, "Oh, I'm dying to go to Cartagena." And I said, "Well, I hope so you go." And then he took the manuscript and said, I'll call you soon." And then he closed the door. And then I thought, well, probably that'll hear from him again. And the next day I was at work. I was working in one of those office buildings in awful places in Wall Street. And he called me at work and he said, "Oh, like I just finished reading your novella, and I really loved it. I like it. I like it. I like that you write from under your epidermis." And nobody has ever said anything like that to me. And then I just said, "Oh my God, this is incredible. I'm going to faint." And then he said, "Well, I told him that." I said, "No, just come to the class and you can do all these processes." And that's how I met. That's how we met.
Uh-huh. And what was he like as a teacher?
I'm so Manuel as a teacher.
Yeah.
Well, he was a very similar teacher. I mean, he was like nobody else. He was not like no teacher that I've ever met before or ever again. He was me, Manuel, all the time. He had created this public persona, and that's what but he was in private like that too. So it was just Manuel was something he had, this personality he created that was so fantastic and became mythological. Because of all the things he said, the way he behaved, the way he spoke, the brilliant things and silly things and funny things he said. And he made us write movies that were written already. So well, think about a movie that you like and then take it to the point of view of one of the characters in the movie and then write a scene or do it with a book, any book that you like and you become that character and then write it from that point of view.
Well, you talk about this in your wonderful book, Eminent Maricones.
Yeah.
And would you tell us a little bit, first of all, about his persona, which you described so beautifully here, and then also about the character that you chose to portray when you were rewriting the film from the perspective of a secondary character. But tell us about him as a figure. I mean, this marvelous personality that he created for himself, and also about your.
Really, like no other teacher that I had ever encountered, and he was not like any academic I ever met. So he talked about just movies and Hollywood actresses and and a little bit about writing, but then now and then he would say something really astonishing about writing, but he would not. He said, "I wonder at the end that we finished doing that exercise." He said, "Oh, I want you to learn structure because that's what the most important thing for a writer." And I thought, "Oh, structure." So I chose to write it from the point of view of the mother's sister's basic in the movie Carrie, and
the mother.
So it was like her mother, and inside the mother, that character, and it was very surprising. And whatever I wrote was already written because then the second thing I did was like Anna Karenina, and I thought, well, I'll be Anna Karenina and write a scene from the novel, pretending that I am Anna Karenina and what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking. And I think that was the beginning to think of fiction in a different kind of way, not just more playful but also more imaginative. I felt very free in his the way he instructed us or tried to guide us. And he accepted like the way we were, the way how we wrote, but he was trying to instill in us some principles that then have used since then in everything I've written. And it was to first of all to think about structure. And then that was the main thing, really. And then he had nothing ever to say about anything that I gave. I said, "Oh, fine, I like it." And I wanted to hear more. And he said, "Fine, make it more poetic." And I said, "And?" He said, "No, that's it, make it more poetic." So I went, home and then I thought, how do I make this thing more poetic? And so it was always finding,
What did
it was teaching us, or at least me, that's how I saw it, new ways to approach writing prose, and not to make it seem like something harder, but like more like a mystery, more like a game, like something very playful, and then you could discover more things about yourself and about the people you were trying to write about. I don't know if I've been, I've done justice to him. Over the years I've talked a little bit about these people, but for me it was very magical. It was freeing. I felt very free, and I thought, I'll do whatever. Like, it sounds so fantastical and so far-fetched, and I'll just do it whatever he says, and that's how I started writing. Like sort of full time from that moment on forward.
Well, you did say that he in your book that it how you became a writer because you could have been a frivolous person, but you.
Yes. Well, he talked about that story. Well, he said that every gay man who was wanted to be a writer, there was a moment that came when that person, like it had happened to him when he was like young, and his friend of him gave him that advice. He said, well, now you have two choices here. You can be a silly queen and become a hairdresser and spend your time always talking about dresses and hair, or you can become a woman, a real woman, and then write. And I thought, that's insane. I don't know what he's saying. But then I mentioned, he was talking about like the moment when you really accept that you're going to be a writer and nothing else. And then, you won't let anything stop you until you've done what you wanted to do. And so become serious about it. It's like, he was very frivolous on the surface, but he was extremely serious in his discipline as a writer, and he was, his days were, he had written in his little tiny books, diaries, 8 o'clock breakfast, coffee, 9 o'clock this, 10 o'clock that, 11 o'clock a movie, letter to my mother, all these things, all these days were organized, by, like the hour, the half hour, and it was, that discipline that was astonishing.
What do you talked about in your book also about what do you think Bedford Street and New York gave to him, and then what happened when there was a moment when he was no longer happy here. So what was that trajectory like? Because you were with him through that, right?
Some of it, but when I met him, he was still he was very famous at that moment. I think that it was also the first moment that as a writer he encountered not just praise but severe criticism and even hostility. The third book was the Buenos Aires affairs, and he had gotten death threats, and so
from whom?
So
from whom?
The government, anonymous people, I don't know, they called him and sent letters. They tell him that either he will shut up or they will kill him. He had to shut up, and then that's when he decided to leave Argentina, and so it was something was shaking very deeply. Perhaps he thought that he might be able, once he became known, he could, live part of the time in Argentina and the rest in Europe or any places that he liked, and then that's when he realized he could live in Argentina the way the way this society was configured, and the way he was. Although many people liked him and he had good friends, for example, he did a wicked caricature of Borges, and he played Borges almost like a corpse, saying all these wise things about people, and were very stiff and they often stiff over the lip, and Manuel was the opposite, the total opposite of that. He was very spontaneous, and there was something profoundly revolutionary about his way of being in the world. It was like in broke every norm, you know. He was like so effeminate. I had never seen anybody that effeminate before. Well, maybe in movies or something, or in the streets or walking around, but I had never known a person like that. And to become a friend of mine, I was very young, I was 19, 20, 21. And so, you know, that was a bit, but through my admiration for him, I became closer to him, and then to that, to the part of being homosexual, but I didn't have to act like a robot, but I didn't have to have all these ideas that were so, you know, like you have to be politically this way and exactly that way, but because he's free, you know. And he was very, you know, like the things that people have always, you know, like being outraged about homosexuals. A lot is like, people say that homosexuals are extremely promiscuous. And Manuel just said, you know, sex is just it's a physical act. It has nothing to do with anything. It's like going to the bathroom or having a meal or sitting down to read the newspaper. And he mystified this subject that was taboo, you know, especially in Latin American literature at that time, which was to write about sexuality and about sex. And that was a huge break in consciousness at that time.
Does anyone in the audience have a question? Do you? Do Marguerite and Esther, do you? Or is there anything that we haven't asked you, Jaime?
I have a question actually for Jaime. Hi, Jaime. We've met before. We're both friends of Edith Grossman. I'm Esther Allen, so it's lovely to see you.
Yes.
So I'm just curious. You've always alternated in your own work. When you were working with Puig, you were writing in Spanish.
Yes.
The workshop was in Spanish, and you've always alternated between Spanish and English in your work. And how does that work for you? How do you decide when to write in Spanish, when to write in English?
I didn't decide it really. It was after living here for so many years. I had trouble remembering how people talk in Colombia. You know, the slang and the language, especially where I come from the coast, it changes all the time, very, very quickly, and it's sort of kind of well, it's like the Spanish language in the Caribbean, which is very free. It's the only part that the Spanish language does not have an academy of the language. And Edith Grossman said something very profound to me once. She said that she thought that English was much more informal language. That was much more creative as a language at this point in history, because in the English language there is no academy telling you how you have to write. Whereas in Spain, you know, there was this august institution that's from the days of the Inquisition, in which, you know, if you made a mistake, you know, complicating the verbal tense or something, it was, you know, like the sort of death or something, and the words did not change. It was all like, we were afraid of all these new languages that people, all those old languages that people began to speak it, and in Spain at that time again, and which Franco had prohibited. And so the language that's where a lot of that writing that was done in Spain became very cartoonish, and it didn't have any Jews because they had this monster institution looking at everything and that's how people look at language back then. And then came the Latin Americans, you know, with the Baroque, and which was, you know, not since like that, since Góngora, in that it's so free, so wild, so imaginative, and that's what I believe that Manuel gave me permission to do that, because he already said, oh no, you write in any language that we know, and he knew like 4 or 5 languages. I think at that point he didn't really know Portuguese, but you know, it is Italian and French he spoke, and English he spoke as well, and you know, in Spanish and I don't know what else. And then in his lifetime, he wrote novels in 3 languages. He wrote novels in Spanish, in English, and in Portuguese. So he was like the writer. So even today, I think he's a little ahead of his time because it was like the language, the writer of the future. Nowadays, there are writers in the United States who were born in so many different places 10 years when they were children, and from the 5 continents, or how many continents, 6 continents, and they write in different languages. People like John Balaguer, and so it's possible to be enslaved by one language, which is usually the language that the conquering race imposed, the Spanish would punish, even when I was a boy in Colombia, you had to be speak carefully, and then you couldn't use slang in the classes speaking with the other students. So it's all this formality about language, but he was trying to impose the language how they experience it in Spain. So the French did the same with their subjects in Africa, and the Dutch with theirs in Africa too, and so and many of them in Asia. So this issue, she liberated language in a way, I think, in a way that people never think of. You think that Joyce will be. Well, Joyce was very important that way. But just sorry to the future, that there will be a future in which, movies will be different. Novels will be written in a different kind of way. He talked in an interview about how he thought that when he thought of a novel, he didn't think of like the regular kind of narrative novels that we read about. He would think of them as shows. And so he would just write a movie in his head, and then he would write the scripts that he wrote about it. For example, the script that he wrote about the Spider Woman, I don't know if some of you have seen it. How many of you have seen the script? The
Kiss of the Spider
Kiss of the
Woman.
Spider Woman.
Yeah,
Sorry?
many of us.
Lots of us, yeah.
Most of us, most of us.
So what is going? What's happening?
No, most of us have seen The Kiss of the Spider Woman.
The Spider Woman, later I saw the producer had bought the final version of the novel, to keep of himself or whatever. That must be very valuable. And what I discovered is that he would draw scenes for every single passage of the novel, because he needed to know, even though there were only 2 people in that cell. He wanted to know exactly in which part of the cell that each one was speaking when they appeared talking in the novel. And so they had all these beautifully drawn,
Storyboards.
Paintings
Yep.
of every proper moment in the novel. And,
You say in your book that Puig hated William Hurt's performance. Is that right?
Yes, he did. That was perverse. It was like very perverse in a way. It was charming. But no, he didn't like William Hurt. Well, I think because William Hurt he imitated Manuel. I think he studied Manuel very carefully, talking to him. And then everything that Molina does, those expressions were Manuel's expressions. So he borrowed them for his performance. And that's why he sort of was sent out on the screen. And I think the performance worked very, very well for the role.
Well, I remember, I thought it was an amazing performance, but that makes sense because it's always hard to see yourself reflected. I mean, in writing or in life, no.
Yeah. No, I think that Molina was a part of Manuel, like there's a part of all those people, I think that the 2 characters are, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and you fall into the Quixote's cyber the Santa Panza, and I think that Molina was the one he really deeply cared about the most was Molina and Valentin. No, I say Valentin. I'm sorry, Valentin, but Molina is the serious one. Whereas, Molina is the frivolous one. And so, but he wasn't. I think deeply he was more he appeared that he was, a very frivolous person because of the things that he said, that he never read books, and, and I didn't see any books in the apartment on Bedford Street, a few books only. But he several, but then when he talked about books, he would talk about, the Quixote, and he knew passages of the Quixote. So it was all, like he had created this fiction about Manuel Puig being, sort of like the silly queen, because maybe if they laughed about him, he would tend to laugh about them, deceive them into thinking that was who he was, and they did not understand him as a persona that he used. It was also a political thing to way to write, because it became. It also liberated the criticism. It liberated, queer picture, into a literary form of critical discourse. And nowadays, you see a lot of that kind of, the way he sort of like, even though he leaned heavily on theory, he was not a theoretician, and he took whatever he wanted from it, and then sort of. Turn it upside down, in his hands. So, it's,
So, Jaime, we are going to advocate for the reissue of your book, because
Absolutely.
it's really an incredible piece of history, and the next time I hope your back isn't hurting and you can be with us.
Can I also?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just also want to relay greetings from Luisa Valenzuela. And she said she was very, she just wanted to send you an abrazo. She's, as we speak, she's at the Buenos Aires Book Fair, but she was quite jealous that we'd be talking to you and she wouldn't be.
So were you, well then Marguerite is going to talk about Luisa now. Were you and Luisa hanging out in the village also?
No, I asked Manuel for a recommendation, and he was leaving New York at that point. He said, "But go talk to Luisa at Colombia, and so I'm going to talk to her." And she wrote a lovely letter for me to take to Colombia to the Ministry of Culture, so they would give me a scholarship to come back here to study at Colombia, something like that.
Ah.
She was glowing. She was really extraordinary. I think she's important.
Oops.
Oh, okay. I don't know if you can hear me, but she didn't lose track of you. Just, I don't know if you.
I think we lost Jaime, but I think,
That was
thank you. Now, Marguerite is going to tell us a little bit about the other author who lived in the village. She was teaching at NYU when I was there.
Actually, right. So Luisa Valenzuela, for those of you who may not be familiar, so many things are going to come full circle here. She was born in 1938 in Buenos Aires. Her mother, Helen Levinson, was a very well-known writer at the time and really close to Borges. And Borges is going to weave in and out of this tale and crisscross with Puig and with Luisa. Luisa kind of grew up with Borges because the Levinson household was a literary salon. Lots of people came, lots of writers. She had a girlhood crush on Cortázar, as everybody did, who met him. But Levinson and Borges used to write stories together. And so this element of play that Jaime was talking about was something that was really important for Luisa growing up, seeing adults playing with words, playing with stories. And this was, it was just something that was part of her life, really. was a journalist, like very much actually like Martí. She wrote about politics. She wrote about sports. She got credited to because she wanted to travel. She got credited to write about soccer here in Brazil. She wrote about culture. She wrote about fashion. She lived in Mexico City. She lived in Paris, and she never wanted to live in New York. She was terrified of New York. She thought it was too big, too noisy, too dangerous. And so she thought that she would eventually settle in Paris or London or someplace like that. She did live in Paris. She actually married a merchant sailor when she was 20, had a daughter. That marriage obviously didn't last. And she eventually she was getting a reputation in Argentina as a short story writer, as a journalist, and as a literary figure. She quite early on was writing what today are called microficciones, or what is it called in English?
Flash fiction.
Yeah. But she was doing this from the time she was a child, and I think they come back to some of the games that Borges and Bioy and Cortázar were playing in her living room with her mother, which is kind of a lovely thing. So the first time she came to the United States was to go to the University of Iowa International Writers Program at the behest, at the recommendation of Manuel Puig. So, yeah, and that was where she first, as she said, is where I first discovered. She used the word discovered that I was a Latin American writer, and I said, well, okay, how did that happen? Just because there are other Latin American writers there. And she said, in Argentina, and many of us are familiar with this, Argentina has considered itself historically very European and been very much in denial about the fact that it is in Latin America. The other thing that's very curious, and really, I'm sure you realize this, and a lot of other people in the room know, as recently as the 90s, the late 90s, in Argentina, you would find books in Spanish from Spain, but you wouldn't find them from Peru or from Colombia or from Venezuela. So Latin, to some extent, that's still true. Argentine writers were certainly aware of what was happening in France and England, the United States, and Spain. But as far as what was happening right on their continent, it was like a black hole. And which is really, it's an arresting thing to think about. And so it's not just when writers say, well, I discovered here that I was a Latin American writer. It's not an affectation. And then when Luisa was about to, she had to stop in Washington to get her visa so that she could go on to Iowa City, and she was told, no, you can't just go to Iowa City, you have to stop in New York. And she was very nervous. And before she had left Buenos Aires, she went, as one does, to a seer to have her fortune told. And the woman told her, you will go to a city full of tunnels, and the tunnels will be very important. And she thought, oh no, that's Caracas. And so she takes the bus up, and they go through the Lincoln Tunnel. And she's like, oh, well, maybe so. And she goes through the Lincoln Tunnel, she sees the skyscrapers, and she's starting to get a good feeling. But she's still very nervous. She's in Times Square, which was not what it is today. It was full of porn movie houses and a lot of crime. And it was for Luisa, which is curious, because she's so bold in her personal life. She's so bold in her fictions, and yet she was very intimidated. She was fascinated and also intimidated. Like, this was a great place to visit, but maybe not so much for living. But she went on to Iowa City, and then she came back. One of the things that I think is really interesting about her, and I just want to just pause a little bit, this question of Puig and Valenzuela and Argentina. They both had books censored at about the same time. And so, as Jaime was telling us, Puig's book was censored, and he was threatened by the AAA, which was the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, which was a militia, and they were given power to fight, to hunt, round up and do terrible things to people who were perceived as communist or in any way different. So homosexuals, for sure, at that time, anyone who was against the military dictatorships that just kept succeeding each other, one after the other, in the late 60s and 1970s, until the coup of March 24th, 1976, which is often referred to as the Dirty War coup. That's a problematic term now because it wasn't a war. It was totally asymmetrical. But this is the civilian military dictatorship that is responsible for the disappearance of some 30,000 Argentines. So Puig's book was censored earlier, before the coup, for sexual content. Luisa wrote a book called Como en la Guerra, which was translated as He Who Searches, but she had a scene of torture in it. That scene was, the book was censored for that scene. Luisa was arrested, and it's an experience that she's very reticent to talk about. I think because she was released, but I think also in deference to people who experienced far worse things than she. And she left, she stayed 2 years into that regime and installed herself she had already left, but installed herself for the long term in New York in 1978. Her experience, as I was saying before, in this little village that was the West Village, and we're talking about the real West Village. We're talking about Bedford Street, Carmine Street, that Bleecker Street, that little sort of island within the island, that was yet extremely cosmopolitan. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting. And we talked about this in our virtual, well, for us it was real, for you it'll be virtual, talk. She was very lucky to be introduced to Susan Sontag, who brought her into the New York Institute for the Humanities, which was very international. And one of the things that one of the persons that she became close to and also argued with a lot was Joseph Brodsky, and the Russian poet who would go on to win a Nobel Prize, and who had had to leave the Soviet Union. Their disagreement was very stark. Brodsky said repression is maybe bad for writers, but that doesn't matter so much. It's great for literature. And Luisa was outraged by this position. She said it can't be good for anyone. It just, if it's not good for writers, it can't be good for literature. They never ever, they just continue to butt heads on this question. But I think it gives you a sense of how intense and how she was always arguing questions that were not at all abstract. Right.
And wasn't there a little bit of gossip in this conversation with Jill Levine? And
Yes. Jill Levine offered the insight, which I cannot corroborate, that there was that Luisa and Brodsky were lovers. I don't know, and I don't know. I don't know.
She didn't deny it though.
She did not deny it. I didn't ask any follow-up questions because I'm a very polite person. But next time I see her in person, I may well inquire. I think the other. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh. No. I wanted to ask you about the book that she wrote in.
So a couple of things happened in terms of her writing. Her relationship to English was, and it's still, she really values the Anglo-Saxon parts of English. She's not so interested in the ways in which English is receptive to other languages. And this is something that comes up when I'm translating her work. She'll always say Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Saxon. Which is, I think, a little different from Puig. She wrote a book. There are two books that I think that associate her most strongly with New York. One is Novela Negra con Argentinos, or Black Novel with Argentines. And this is a novel that centers on two Argentine exiles, and it's a policier. It's a detective novel. She said she always hated detective novels because you have to know who killed whom at the beginning in order to write. And she said, I never know what's going to happen. I sit down to write, and what happens, happens. And she said, but there was something about New York that was so noir. And she said that I kept going back to it. And I wanted to do something with this form, which was, again, something given to her by New York. And so she figured out, she said, I'll just tell everybody who killed who. She said, but just get it out there. And so she does on the first page, but she said it was the motivation. And she was going to call the book El Motivo, but she didn't ultimately. But she said it was again, the mystery. She had to have the real mystery, which was why this took place. And I asked her, I said, well, do you think that being in New York liberated you from the strictures of that genre that you had always avoided like the plague, that it sort of needled you? And she said, yeah, I think it did. She said there was something so noir about the city at that time that I wanted to write noirishly, if that's a word, without the constraints of the novel. The other thing the other book that she wrote when she went back to Argentina, in Spanish it's called La Travesía, and it's being called The Crossing in English. And this was
Being called by you.
well by Luisa and me.
Yes. Just wanted to.
Yeah.
You're translating it.
Well, maybe. The interesting thing about this was, again, a person she became very close to was Bolek Grzyński, whom some of you may have known. He was a Polish sculptor and painter. He had worked with Thaddeus Cantor. He had been very much part of the Polish avant-garde and was also kind of self-exiled to New York. They became very, very close friends, and I got to know Bolek through different connections. But Bolek, and this is what Luisa's novel is about, founded at the Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, which was a notoriously damaging psychiatric hospital back in the day. Bolek founded an arts project, and he lived at the hospital. He founded this arts project, outsider art, what have you, and it transformed the hospital, and it transformed care of mental patients beyond Creedmoor. And so the novel that Luisa wrote is very much rooted in this experience that happened through her friendship with Bolek. It's about other things too. It's about one of the characters is a very well-known dominatrix. She was here during the AIDS, the horrible years of AIDS. She was really fascinated by, she said, New York. She was fascinated by role-playing. She was fascinated by what was then called cross-dressing. She was fascinated by all the erasure and of categories and the pressure on categories. And she was also, she said there was also death everywhere, and living in the village during those years. And she said as strong as the forces of death were, the forces of resistance and performing terror were as equally strong, at least for her. Interestingly enough, she would go back to Argentina because she felt that she was losing Spanish, and she did not go back to Argentina until 1988, after 10 years. And the two books that she wrote, when she went back to Argentina, she thought, well, now here I'm recovering my language, and I should look back and write about New York. But La Travesía is written, though there are quite a few grammatical past tenses, you're right there, it's happening right there. So the push and pull of New York internalized and New York externalized is really interesting in terms of when she was here and when she went back. In terms of years when she was here, this brings us back to Borges. She was in a cafe one day, having lunch on 7th Avenue in a restaurant that no longer exists near Sheridan Square with a garden in the back. And she said she looks up and who should come in but Borges and Maria Kulama. And so his wife at the time. And so they renew acquaintance because he had known her as a girl. And of course, Borges being Borges has some favors to ask of her, which is to basically be, as he put it, his interlocutor, which meant to kind of follow him around and be his interpreter. He was at Columbia at the time, and so every day while he was there, she would go up from the village to Columbia to interpret for him. And there's a very famous anecdote from that time where she was very nervous about this because Borges could be mean, especially for people who were interviewing him or interpreting for him. She revered him, she loved him, but she was also very nervous about this. And so she asked, she was interpreting for him, and then the next day they got together and she said, Borges, because she always called him Borges. She said, in the night before she had asked him, you seem to use some symbolism of the pencil. Is it a phallus? And he said, oh, you're such a child. You don't even know how to read. You're such a child. And so the next day she said, Borges. And he said, I actually gave this a lot of thought. Maybe you're not such a child, but it's not a phallus. It's God's middle finger. And this is a story that has been told many times.
Say again, what's sorry?
God's middle finger.
Oh, okay. Sorry, cutting.
And she said, and when he told me that, I laughed, we all laughed. And she said, but it still always gives me a chill when I think about it, because I still don't know exactly what he meant by it. And so there's and she said, I was very happy to leave him uptown in Columbia and I could come back to the West Village. So there was that. I think the other thing that she said, about her years in New York was that there was a part of New York for whatever mood you were in, right? If you were feeling one way, you went to the Upper East Side. If you were feeling another way, you went to the Upper West Side. If you wanted a certain amount of scrunge, you went to the East Village. But if you wanted to feel, she said, if you wanted to be able to feel like yourself, you went to the West Village, and that's where you lived. So when she moved from Carmine Street, it was to two other places. One was, she was the first non-Anglo writer to be appointed to the Berg Chair at NYU in creative writing, and that was also something that Puig helped to facilitate. And then after that, as she said, I went back to just being a regular, associate professor for a lot less money. But then she went from that lovely apartment, spacious apartment, right in Washington Square to the Washington Square Muse. And there are lots of pictures of her photographed. Interestingly enough, always her favorite pose was, it has those wrought iron tall gates, and she would like to open the gates and be photographed. And it's kind of an iconic West Village image of her. She said a couple of other things that I think are worth passing on, and it has to do about herself as a writer, that when she was in New York, she was always writing about Argentina. Mm-hmm. And then when she went back to Argentina, she wrote a lot about New York. Mm-hmm. And then she has a lot of stories where the setting is not named, but there's a lot of New York in it. So I think that's really significant. She has an image of New York. I said, well, what do you miss? And she said, the freedom. She said, people come here to discover who they are and to discover a world in which they can live. And then she said, there was a pet shop on the corner of 6th Avenue, just sort of up toward Paris Street. And she said, and it had 2 doors. And you walked into the pet shop and all the birds were free. They flew free. And she said, that's my image of New York. You go into the space, and all the birds are just free. She said, that's New York. That's the West Side.
Well, thank you. Thank you for evoking.
Oh, yeah. Questions? Anything?
There are so many questions. I think could you tell us a little bit about the Travesía? Because it's in this video that we recommend you listen to in the online festival, you actually read a fragment.
Just a very short fragment that takes place on Dougal Street.
Uh-huh.
It's a big novel, and it's got lots of different pieces. It's a how can I put this? It's pretty phantasmagoric in certain ways, and there's a lot of sort of hallucinatory writing, things that are again settings that are supposed to be caring, shall we say. So I read a lot of the writing about Creedmoor, and it's also very much Argentina at the time, right? So there's a conflation of this mental hospital that was in many ways hellish with what was going on in Argentina, which was indeed hellish, and so when you think about the spaces that were clandestine torture centers, there were hospitals that were used, there were police stations, there were schools, there were factories, there were private residences, estancias. So there's this sense, there's a lot of fascination on the part of the narrator with sort of walking on the wild side. She's very interested in this, her friend who is a dominatrix, and there's somebody who might be an ambassador, who might be somebody else. There's a lot of shifting identities, uncertain identities, and terror, really, and of things, people, places, maybe being something completely different than what they are.
In the same way that I think we have to reissue this book, there are other stories. For example, the Institute for the Humanities is such a fulcrum for, bringing together all of those international intellectuals and bringing them to New York and to the village. And then there are people like Edie Grossman, who also are, the poles around whom, in her case, people gather. And I think, I would like to think that this is the start of a conversation that maybe will lead to some of that being written. And I think we have to leave. I know that they want to throw us out at 8, but I also want to invite you to come and see the video mapping at the corner of Greenwich and 7th Avenue, which is by the extraordinary artists, multimedia artists who are the heart of Sant Jordi NYC, because they create the website, they create the video mappings, and they're absolutely extraordinary. So Greenwich and 7th, that kind of bunker-like building there, but they're going to transform it into
After dark, is that what it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's supposed to start now. So.
Okay.
Thank you all
Thank you so much for being here.